Welcome to Tuesday's edition of Renew Plus. I'm Pastor Tony. Thank you for joining us again today. And again, we're in week number 4 of our series, The New and Living Way, all part of the Navigating the New course that we're on right now. We'll be on for a while. I want to go back over to where we left off yesterday, the book of Hebrews chapter 9. We looked at these a large part last week, but we're going back over them again, reviewing them, and going a little bit deeper with this, because what we are doing is uprooting that old sin consciousness in our life. As believers, there is no basis for having a sin consciousness in your life, because the finished work of Jesus and His shed blood completely wiped out sin. The record books of heaven, it's just like you never even sinned if you were to look at the record books of heaven, because the claims of justice have been completely satisfied, and Jesus paid the full price. In fact, He was an overpayment, as we've already discussed, an overpayment for our salvation and redemption. So God's not looking at you as a sinner anymore, but many times we're still looking at ourselves as a sinner. And the reason is a lot of times we're getting pounded with a lot of works, performance-based religion. And it's a lot of dead works, because really, if you have a sin consciousness, you have that on the inside of you. I've got to find some justification. And if you don't find it, or you don't see it in Jesus, then you're going to try to find it in yourself. You're going to try to justify yourself, at least partially, by your own good works and performance. Now listen, there is a place for good works. There is a place for doing good and having right performance and living right. Don't get me wrong, but it is never in the context of either obtaining or maintaining your right standing with God. That is all founded and based on the finished work of Jesus, on His sacrifice, and on His shed blood. So therefore, as far as righteousness goes, as far as my approach to God goes, it's all Jesus-centered. The focus has to be, the spotlight has to be on Jesus and not on me. If I'm in there at all, the enemy's going to play on that. In fact, if you're in there at all, if you're focused on your good works as a basis for approaching God and receiving from Him, being in right standing with God, having righteousness before God, then the enemy is always going to magnify you. And of course, he's going to magnify your faults and your failures. And see, that was all part of the old system, the old covenant of law that was works, performance based. But see, God found fault with that. He replaced it with a new covenant that was completely Jesus-centered. And of course, when I say Jesus-centered, He is the perfect sacrifice, offering the perfect blood for all of us. And that's what did away with sin. Now here in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 12, we read this yesterday. It says, "Not with the blood of goats and calves, but with His own blood He entered the most holy place once for all." Now that'll give us a clue right there of the value and the worth of the sacrifice of Jesus and His blood, that He only had to do it once and once for all. He was so good, so valuable, so perfect. He was one and done, as we like to say. Once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. And again, we pointed out the Amplified, it was a complete redemption covering every aspect of our life, every part of our life. And it is a redemption that lasts forever. It's not going to have an expiration date. Jesus is not going to have to come back. His blood's not going to evaporate in heaven, and He's going to have to come back and renew that again. No, He obtained an eternal redemption for all of us. Now look at verse number 14. It says, "How much more?" Now again, he's comparing the old with the new. He said, "How much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered Himself without spot to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God." Now he's talking to believers here. The only thing that's going to uproot that sin consciousness, that unworthiness that's embedded in all of us, that even we carry over into this new life experience in Jesus, the only thing that's going to counteract that and uproot it is this right here, this reality and truth, that Jesus, because of who He is, who He was, the Son of the living God, offered Himself and shed His blood for us. That blood and that sacrifice of Jesus was without spot and without blemish. It was perfect. And so he offered himself without spot to God. Now notice, when we begin to apply that same reality to our own hearts here on the earth, what does it do? It should cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. That's the only thing that's going to cleanse your conscience. Not your works, not part Jesus, part you. It's going to have to be completely and absolutely Jesus and only Jesus and what he did for us in his blood. That will cleanse our conscience. The same blood that he applied in heaven, you have to apply that reality of his blood on earth in your own heart. That cleanses your conscience, listen, from dead works to serve the living God. Now I want you to see, what is dead works? Well, that is all that, the works of man, the self-righteous, self-centered works and performance of men trying to justify themselves, trying to pay the sin debt off, trying to cleanse their own conscience. And you see, we going that is a dead-end road. Literally, that is a dead-end road. That will never get you there. That is not the highway that's going to lead you into the presence of God with confidence. But notice, once your conscience is cleansed by the finished work and the shed blood of Jesus, then you do away with and get rid of those dead works of self-righteous, self-focused, performance-based religion. That'll never get it done. See, all the religions in the world based on basically self-performance to try to justify themselves. They're trying to get rid of that sin consciousness. And of course, they never get there. They never get to the place where they can approach God, and they can approach their idea of God, some religions, with a confidence and a boldness. That they can never come to that. They can never have the righteousness consciousness, because this is the only way that this is going to happen. And it gets rid of that dead works to serve the living God. Now, look on down to verse number 24. It says, "For Christ has not entered the holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true." In other words, Jesus, when he got done, didn't go into the earthly tabernacle or the temporary temple that they had erected and offer his blood there. No, he didn't go into there. He said, which are copies of the true. But he went into heaven itself. He didn't go into the copy and the shadow. He went into heaven itself, the real. He went into heaven itself. He said, now to appear in the presence of God for us on our behalf. Jesus went into the very presence of God on our behalf, and he put his blood there. He offered himself up. And of course, God the Father accepted the sacrifice of his Son as the complete payment and to satisfy the claims of justice against all of us for all time. And of course, that is what's bearing witness in heaven right now. Boy, that is powerful right there. Jesus went in for it. This is my confidence. This is the reason and the basis for me coming confidently and boldly into the presence of God. It says, verse 25, not that he should offer himself often. See, that's what they did under the old covenant. Not that he should offer himself often, as the high priest enters the most holy place every year with the blood of another. Again, a comparison. This is what they did all over and over and over again. Every year, annual sacrifices, continual sacrifices. They're being offered up for their sins. And every time they brought one, that was that reinforcement of that sin consciousness that the ultimate sacrifice had not been offered up, and their sins still retained. They were still retained before God. They could not approach God in his presence. Now, verse 26 said, he then would have offered. Jesus would then have had to suffer often. See, there's that word again, often, since the foundation of the world. But now, right now, present tense reality, but now once, at the end of the ages, he has appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. I want you to see that right there. That Jesus once and once for all, at the end of the ages, has appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Now I'm going to read verse 26 in the Amplified one more time. It says, For then would he often have had to suffer over and over again since the foundation of the world. But as it now is, the now time, the now present tense reality, he has once for all at the consummation and close of the ages appeared to put away and abolish sin by the sacrifice of himself. That's a claim that no other sacrifice, no other work under the old covenant of law could ever do. That it could put away and abolish sin. That word for put away and abolish sin can also be translated disannul, reject, once and once for all. Notice that Jesus' sacrifice, his shed blood, appeared to put away and abolish, disannul, and reject sin by the sacrifice of himself. See, that is the reason we can come with boldness and confidence into the presence of God. Because sin has been abolished, put away, done away with, disannulled, and rejected. This is our basis for coming into the presence of God. Old covenant of law could not do it. Keeping the law couldn't do it. Animal sacrifices couldn't do it. But the perfect sacrifice of Jesus and his blood did do that for all of us. Now let's go over to chapter 10. We're going to kind of introduce this. We were over into chapter 10 to some degree last week, but we're going to pick it up in chapter 10. Now remember, Hebrews wasn't originally written in chapter and verse. It was one continual storyline, context going all the way through. Now we do that for reference sake. Thank God for that. You know, it'd be kind of hard to find. All right, go down 50 paragraphs, third sentence, fourth word. And we don't have to do that. These are written for reference. But again, they were all in context, okay? So from chapter 9, what we were just reading there, he's already established those things. He carries that over into chapter 10 and verse 1. He said, "For the law, having a shadow of the good things to come, and not the very image of those things, can never with those same sacrifices which they offer continually year by year make those who approach perfect." Now I want you to see that word perfect right there. Now sometimes we think, well, we don't know what we're talking about right here. I'm not perfect. Even as believers, we look in the mirror and we see zits and moles and blemishes and hair out of place, and because we're judging on the outside, or we look at our own conduct and we see it's not perfect. Well, that's not what he's talking about here. Listen, first of all, Jesus' sacrifice was perfect. His blood was perfect. He perfectly cleansed the record books of heaven of all claims of justice against us and all sin debt. When God the Father caused you to be born again, you and me as believers to be born again, made new creations, he didn't leave us the way we were. He made a perfect work in our spirits. God looks at you in your spirit and sees somebody who is a child of God, his own child. He looks at you in perfection. That doesn't mean you do everything right. That doesn't mean that, your conduct is perfect. You make mistakes still outwardly. You still have an outward flesh that's not perfect. That's not what he's talking about right here. But what he's talking about right here is perfect according to the record books, like we already talked about yesterday, the record books of heaven, the perfect work in the born again recreated spirit. And listen, he's also, like we looked at in other scriptures, perfected you in conscience. He has given you the means whereby you can get rid of that sin consciousness and perfect your conscience into having a bold and confident approach to God without any sense of condemnation, inferiority, guilt, or shame, just like sin never existed. That's what he's talking about. Those sacrifices couldn't do that. It couldn't do any of those things. But the sacrifice and the finished work of Jesus and his blood did do that. Now verse number 2, "For then would they not have ceased to be offered." In other words, if the Old Testament, Old Covenant system of law, works, and animal sacrifices could have made us perfect according to conscience, done away with sin, abolished it, then those things would have ceased to be offered. He says, "For the worshipers, once purified, would have had no more consciousness of sin. Now there it is again. Notice this. The worshipers once purified. And see, this is all related to perfect. That word perfect there in verse number 1. Perfect, purified, once purified, would have had no more consciousness of sin. See, by inference right here, he's telling us because of the once and once for all sacrifice of Jesus and his blood that he's presented in the heavenly holy of holies, then we have been perfected according to sin. We have been purified. And listen, we should have no more consciousness of sin. You should have no more consciousness of sin in your heart. No more sin consciousness. There is no basis for a believer having a sin consciousness. You say, well, I failed, I messed up. Yes, but the blood of Jesus has cleansed us from all sin, past, present, and future tense. That's the good news right there. I tell you what, and I've got to stop right there. We're going to pick this up again tomorrow because this is so important. If you're going to have confidence in approaching God, we've got to deal with correctly sin consciousness and uproot it and eradicate it in our life. Well, join us again tomorrow as we pick up from here. If you like additional materials, go to tonycowan.org. We'll see you tomorrow.